Welcome to the Alcon Maddox Cybersecurity webinar series. In this episode, we'll be joined by Sherry Jones, and we'll be discussing cyber speak for the non-geek. I'm Richie, as many of you already know, and as I've said, joining me today is Sherry Jones, CEO and President of CyberSmart Writing. Say hello, Sherry.
Hi. Hi, everybody. I'm not a geek.
Not a geek. Why don't you, before we get started, why don't you give us a little bit of background on what it is you do at CyberSmart, and also, I guess what would also be interesting from a context perspective, just give us an insight into the kind of clients that you deal with in the cybersecurity space, please.
Sure. Well, I write cybersecurity and technology marketing content for a lot of great companies. My clients include PricewaterhouseCoopers, Micron Technologies, Kaspersky, and Reciprocity, also Cybercrypt, and I have a lot of clients. And I've also written in the past for Deloitte and Itron, which is a power technology company. So so I write thought leadership articles, and I do ghostwriting, and I do blog posts and website content, and all the usual types of writing, white papers and case studies. And I write about cybersecurity, mostly cybersecurity, and my focus is, as my my tagline for my website is tech speak for the non-geek. That includes cyber speak. And what sets me apart from the rest is I have a journalism background. I worked for several decades as a print journalist, and I learned the tricks of the trade of translating complex topics and putting them into easy to understand terminology. And I also learned the art of capturing my reader's attention from the first word and holding it to the last word. Because when you work for a newspaper, every story is competing with every other story in the paper, so you want your stories to be read. So so I bring a lot of knowledge and experience, also my interviewing experience, to my work, and I'm very good at simplifying concepts, grasping them quickly and simplifying them for the average person.
It's really interesting you mentioned the kind of, I guess, the translating complex to simple, because as you know, we've kind of had conversations already. I run a recruitment business here in the UAE focused on the IT channel industry, so cybersecurity specifically, but within that domain, sales and commercial leadership positions. One of the common requests, if you like, of salespeople that work in this space is the ability to translate complex requirements into business cases. So there is a requirement to simplify things, I guess, to some extent. But the challenge is, I guess, when you work within a certain domain and you're surrounded by other people that work within the same domain, you tend to slip into, I'm going to say bad habits, but by bad habits, I mean you assume everybody has the same level of knowledge and awareness as you do, and that can obviously be quite dangerous, especially when you're trying to get across to prospective clients, let's say, a key message that can impact whether or not someone takes up your product or service. So I think it's really interesting, and I'm so excited to have you on the session today, because quite often we talk to vendors or distributors that work within the space, and I think actually your message today is probably a lot more relevant to our listeners, who are typically vendors and distributors anyway, because your advice will help them frame their messages to their potential clients, if that makes sense. So,
I hope so.
Yeah.
And I read an article a few years ago that in which CEOs were quoted as saying that they find a lot of the reading they have to do to be deadly dull. And I wasn't really surprised. A large part of my work is research. I don't know everything about cybersecurity. I learn with every new assignment. I learn new things, and I do a lot of reading, and a lot of the writing is pretty dull. And I think that the same applies for, what I'm saying is that even corporate executives and even geeks, they prefer simple terms and great writing. And I think that sometimes we get that we're thinking about how we sound more than we're thinking about the person who is listening. And in they always talk about the reader. We're really focused. You're supposed to be really focused on the reader when you write. And I think the same when you speak. You want to use the simple terms everyone can understand. Keep it simple. Pretend you're talking to your, I don't know, granddad or somebody who doesn't maybe know much about.
I don't think my granddad would understand cybersecurity anyway.
I'm just talking to your 12-year-old, but 12-year-olds.
I'll tell you a funny story though. I did actually. I was trying to explain the idea of viruses to my wife's grandfather. This was a few years ago, and he was always an avid gardener. And I was trying to explain, you can't just remove if you remove the surface layer, the reality is it's still embedded within your technology, which you didn't really understand. So I explained it to him in terms of, okay, imagine your garden. If you see a weed in the garden, if you just pull the leaves out of the top of the soil, the weed looks like it's gone, but in actual fact, it's very much still there, attacking your vegetables underneath the soil. And that for me is a good example, because it's putting it in the right frame or tongue of the person you're talking to, right? And that's ultimate. That's why, again, I'm super interested to have this conversation with you, because although you're coming at it from a writing and perhaps a marketing content perspective, I look at this from a sales conversation perspective. So I think those two things combined, I think, will be super interesting. Anyway, just to kind of
same thing. I'm selling too, right? So.
Exactly. So then, just to kind of frame, I guess, the topic a little bit more before we get into the 9 key guiding principles that I know you are keen to go through today. I think, look, the global pandemic has really done as much for cybersecurity as it has digital transformation, right? It's really thrust this to the top of everybody's minds. And unless you've been living in a cave for the past 18 months, you'd have realized that as we digitally transform our businesses, we are at the same time potentially opening up ourselves to digital security threats. Now, obviously, understanding these threats to our cybersecurity is one thing. Investing in a solution to mitigate any risk is quite another. And given just how vast the cybersecurity offering now is, and given that every company you speak to has the best solution, what I'm keen to understand today is from a vendor perspective, I guess. How can we make sure that our target audience, our listeners, if you like, or readers, if you want to put it that way, understand their problem and how our solution fits? And as I said, to kind of help our listeners understand, or to help our listeners talk and write about cybersecurity in a way that prospects will listen, you put together 9 guiding principles. So I think let's get started with them. We'll take them one at a time. But before we get into that, anything else you want to mention, just to kind of set the scene, or perhaps explain how you put these together, if that makes sense?
Well, what you just said about how the pandemic has put cybersecurity top of mind is really true. PricewaterhouseCoopers recently did their 24th annual CEO survey of CEOs from around the world, and for the first time, cybersecurity was number 2 in terms of the top concerns that CEOs have worldwide. Not every region, but overall, worldwide, it was number 2, and number 1 was the pandemic, was pandemic issues. So, it really has risen almost to the very top, and that's important to know and to realize. And I think also there's another good reason for being able to talk about cybersecurity in a way that people will listen, and that is, this is a more altruistic vision, but I think that we all care about what we do, and we all believe that cybersecurity is important. And at a time when a cybersecurity breach can conceivably take away our electrical power in the middle of a bitterly cold winter, or it can keep someone who is in the hospital from getting the right medicine, or it can drain our bank accounts or even crash entire economies. It's important for people to know and care about cybersecurity. But if we're using language that they can't understand, or we're using language that's going to bore them, they're not going to be engaged and they're not going to care. So there's another reason if you needed a more altruistic reason. I am a firm believer that.
I think I think it extends a little bit beyond that, though. Not just confusing people, almost intimidating people, which kind of makes people shy away from even having the conversation. And you could perceive that as being naive to some extent, because it is an issue that people need to deal with. But if you can, I think, if you can ultimately set yourself apart as a company that is able to translate this complex topic into layman's speak, so that clients can understand, you'll probably win a lot more business and a lot more lasting partnerships, which is ultimately what we want to do, right? So let's just look into these.
Because they want that. So yeah, so we can give 9 topics. I set these topics not in order of importance, but in sort of a chronological order. Like if you're going to put together a talk or a sales pitch, or you're writing an article or a blog post, this is the order in which you might approach that project. So first of all, number 1 is dare to be different. This goes back to what you were just saying, Richard, that what differentiates your product from all the others in the market, and to really know what that is and be able to articulate it. But also, like, what do you have to say about it that's different? What do you have to say about cybersecurity that's different from what everyone else is saying? Journalism, they say, what's your angle? I could pitch a story to an editor and he says, what's your angle? And they also have a saying, let's see, dog bites man is not a story, man bites dog, that's a story.
That's a story, yeah, you're right, actually.
Corn dog. So anyway, so this is, I had one client that I wrote for, Dr. J.R. Reagan, and he was the Global Chief Information Security Officer at Deloitte, and a totally brilliant man. He studied philosophy in college as well as business. And he always had these great ideas. I was his ghostwriter, and so he would come to me with ideas for articles. And, like, instead of saying to me, let's do an article about how to make cybersecurity more reliable. Everybody's doing that, right? So instead he said, phone companies and utilities have a goal to be up and running 99.999% of the time. What if we had a 99.999 standard for cybersecurity? And you can bet nobody else was writing about that. And we got our article in the Wall Street Journal. And the angle was so unique and so different. And before we do a story, before I write for someone, I try to research it and make sure that no one's already saying this, or if they are, I try to twist it, turn it inside out, and find a creative, unique angle that makes it different from what everyone else is saying.
I think it's a really interesting point, because when you talk about semantics, we have to address this certainly in sales speak all the time, because quite often people don't necessarily understand the things in the same way that we understand. So we have to come up with a number of different ways to articulate exactly the same situation or product or service or whatever it is. And like you said, if you can explain it in a way that is fundamentally different to someone else, then again, that's going to perk people's interest, because people are at least going to be interested in, why is this different, or how is this different to everything else? Just coming up with the same claims as everyone else and being the best is almost a non-belief. People, I don't think, even believe. It's like the world's best coffee, right? No one believes companies have the world's best coffee, because everyone claims it is. So I'm sure to some extent with cybersecurity as well, right? If it's the best product in the market, that's just what you say. That's not really what I believe. So tell me how it's relevant for me. So I think semantics is a really interesting one, right?
So if what you have to say is new and different and fresh, then that is going to compel someone to listen to you or to read what you've written. And that's the first step, isn't it, toward reaching your goals? It's getting their attention.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
So next to, I guess, daring to be different, comes step number 2. And I can see now, as you said, there is definitely chronology here. Tell us about point number 2.
Step number 2 is get to the point.
Yeah.
So busy. Nobody wants a long intro. Nobody wants to read or hear about how cybersecurity is important, how, you know, it's more complex than ever, or, you know, getting more hacks than ever, or it's expensive. Everybody already knows these things. Just skip and get to the point. You know, when you do that, in journalism, again, when you spend a long time to get to the point, that's called burying your lead. And so the lead is the most important part of the story. It should be right up top. And that is going to compel people's attention. So I'll give you an example. I use my own example. I don't, because I don't want to, anyway, I use my own example here. I read an article on consumer identity and access management. And here's the first sentence. Security and marketing, previously considered strange bedfellows, are a match made in digital heaven with consumer identity and access management. Now, the story is about how science, consumer identity and access management, how it collects information, it has all this information about the person who's using it, the person who wants access to your website or to your product. And it's collecting that information for the sake of identifying them and verifying, you know, authenticating. But at the same time, it's also collecting, like it's watching how they're behaving on the site. And it's doing all these things for security reasons. But it's also collecting data for the marketing department. So it's working both ways. It's enabling you to give a more personalized experience and to know more about how your site is used or how your product is used at the same time. So excellent. I didn't wait to the 5th paragraph to tell you that. I told you right up front what's going on.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting way of doing it, because, like you said, you don't. Who gets to the 5th paragraph in an article before they're bored? And also, even in a conversation, right? There needs to be something. You know, even when we're writing sales emails, for example, there needs to be a reason to move from one paragraph to the next, or even to continue a conversation if you're talking to someone over the phone, right? And if you haven't had that hook that is now playing on the mind of the prospect, there's no interest in them remaining engaged in the conversation, right? I'll give you an example, actually, because I've received 3 emails in the past week, three webinar invitations, 1 from a vendor, 2 from 2 different cybersecurity distributors. All of them opened their invitation with pretty much the same line. It was along the lines of cybersecurity has cost X amount of dollars to companies in 2020, and is set to increase to Y amount of dollars in 2021. And they're using this as a hook to get people interested in whatever their webinar is about. And I just wonder, is that even a hook, or are people? I would imagine that is almost a waste of space in an invitation, because people don't really care so much about this now, right? They're saying what everybody already knows and appreciates, right? So it's far better to use something that's relevant to what's actually going to be discussed, right?
Right. Cybersecurity goes up, costs go up every year. It's like dog bites man. It goes up every year. If the cost of cybersecurity breaches plummeted, that would be a great story. But then I guess you wouldn't be selling your product. So unless it was your product that caused that to happen. So yeah, exactly. I recently saw a cybersecurity story. I wouldn't have even read it if I weren't preparing for this webinar, because the first paragraph is, Brendan Wales, Acting Executive Director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, issued both a warning and a hopeful message Monday to organizations struggling with the scourge of ransomware. That's the first sentence. I'm like, oh.
I'm
so
done.
then Ransomware, everybody's doing, the hackers are all out there, they're working hard, they're indiscriminately trying to breach everybody, and we don't have there's no secret weapon to stop them. I'm like, okay, tell me something that we don't already know. But then you get down to the 4th paragraph, and he gives you the hopeful message, which basically is, I'll paraphrase here, is that because they're indiscriminate and they're attacking everyone, if you have the basic cybersecurity controls in place, you are probably not going to get ransomware. If you're doing just the basic cybersecurity fundamentals, many organizations can take themselves out of the low-hanging fruit category. And I thought, wow, that's so interesting, because there's a lot of scare tactics out there about ransomware. Everybody's going to get hit. But he's saying here, wow, if you pay attention to your basic cybersecurity fundamentals, you can feel pretty sure they're going to move on to someone else, because they're not targeting just specifically you. They're looking for anybody who has their defenses down. So
yeah. It is actually super interesting. I guess the other kind of the anecdote there, I was talking to Brian Seeley, world-renowned hacker, a couple of months ago on our webinar series actually, and he was one of the examples he used was it's kind of like a car thief walking around the car park and just trying all the door handles, right? The low-hanging fruit are the ones that have left their cars open. All you need to do is lock the car, and you've already removed yourself from, like you said, that kind of low-hanging fruit. But I think you're absolutely right. That, as the first lead message, is the thing that's going to get people in, right? Like I say, get to the point. And then if there's a solution that's being presented on the back of that point, then now you've got me interested. But that leading statement, I wouldn't have got any further. I wouldn't have got the paragraph 4, which I think you said was where the point was, right?
Yeah, right.
So point number 3, talk us through this one.
Okay, number 3 is stay focused. This doesn't mean, you have an ADHD mind like mine. This is a little challenging because I think and I talk in circles. I usually, I circle back, which is the beauty of it, but still, I take a lot of detours on that highway. And but having a framework to help you stay focused is really helpful. One of my clients, we use a framework that goes like this. This sort of goes with what I was just talking about, getting to the point. What's new, followed by so what, followed by what's next. So what's new is, the compelling thing, the reason you're writing the article, the new thing that, we want to get your attention. So what is, in journalism, they call it the nut graph. It's got the nut and bolts, basically, of why you should be interested. And a lot of people make the mistake of putting the nut graph at the top. They'll tell you, like, there's been more cybersecurity hacks than ever. But what you really want to know is, first is what's new, and then after that, we can give you a little information about why this matters to me, why is it relevant, why should you care? That's the so what. And then what's next is, okay, now that we've given you this great information, what are you going to do with it? We give you some actionable measures, and hopefully they're going to be led after that to call you, So
you're saying that what is not, so I misunderstood it when I was reading our notes before. So what's new is, like you said, the product or service that's now perhaps on offer. So what problem does this address? What's next is not what's next in a developmental life cycle. It's what's next is in, okay, what are the next steps? How can I benefit from this? Or how can I take action to purchase this? Right?
Do with the information. And then, this maybe doesn't apply so much to speaking, but certainly does to writing. Skip the conclusion. Like, when you're done, get out. Don't give me some kind of concluding paragraphs that people don't have time. They're not going to read it. And so it's a waste of your time even to write a conclusion. This is my opinion and it's my approach, but it's what we do at this big client that uses the what's new, what's next and framework. For that very reason, we're trying to be respectful of the time of our audience.
It's interesting, again, just me coming at this from a sales angle, if you like. It's the what's next is super interesting to me because that's ultimately the objective of every interaction is, okay, what is the goal of this interaction, whether it's to book a meeting, send a proposal, get a contract signed, whatever, but you're always guiding the prospect to the next steps. How do I take the next step? What do I have to do? And we would conclude in the way that we would kind of wrap up and let's say recap our understanding of the client's requirements to make sure the solution we provided is relevant before we close, let's say. But I think certainly for the more novice salespeople out there is this tendency, and I say novice because I was a novice at one point, and I used to do this, right? Going over and over and over the message again and again and again in a conversation one, you can actually talk yourself out of a deal. you can talk so much, they're out of the buying mindset and they just want to get out of the room. But also you run the risk of diluting the message and that I think is the big risk, right? So it's understanding what to say, when to say it, and how, at what point in the conversation so that it has the biggest impact.
And then when you're done, stop. I'm not a salesperson, but I actually used to be married to one, or married to a former salesperson, and he used to talk about that silence is golden in sales. Like when you're done, just wait. Yeah. Often they will come out and do something if you just sit there and wait. And listen.
Exactly. The pause is probably one of the most effective tools a salesperson has, but it has to be used at the right time. If you just stop talking, it's just odd. If you stop talking after a question, then that's perfect, because you're indicating that you expect your prospect to answer or give either answer in the way of confirming or answer in the way of relaying more information or more objections, let's say, which are ultimately going to help the conversation progress. So I just wanted to quickly point out there's a few more people that have joined since we started. So just for the people who've joined in the last 5 to minutes, guys, if you have any questions or insights about anything we're discussing along the way, please just feel free to put them in the chat box, and we'll happily read them out as we go. No need to save anything, excuse me, until the end. Yeah, well, this is Sherry, by the way. So we're just walking through your 9 guiding principles, Sherry. So that was number 3. Let's get to number 4.
Number 4 is surprise your audience.
Okay, tell me about that.
Well, in writing, we use aha moments. These are the little epiphanies that get that wake up the reader's mind or the audience's mind, and they get those synapses firing with aha. They realize something you've said is surprising, or it makes them remember something they've forgotten, or it reminds them of something. What it does is it gets their imaginations working, and makes them want more from you. A good surprise to use is humor. If you're inclined that way, and you can take some chances, and like even if your joke falls flat, at least you got their attention. Sympathy.
It's funny you said the attention, I think, is key, because attention is what a lot of salespeople struggle for, irrespective of what they're saying, but especially when we're talking about complex subjects, right? It's getting, no one's going to buy from you if you can't keep their attention. So yeah, I completely agree. Humor is certainly a great way to pull people in, but then obviously you can't keep telling jokes, because then
I don't want to overdo it.
Necessarily jokes is about humor and making the conversation light. What I think is really interesting, you mentioned aha moments, right? What I think is really interesting is, especially in the topic of cybersecurity, because it is so complex, people don't necessarily always understand the cyber vulnerabilities. But I think anecdotal storytelling is a great way to raise awareness of something. It goes, for me, there's kind of three levels of this, if you like. The first approach I would take certainly would be to, let's say, expose their bad experiences, right? So we would discuss, you know, what experiences we had in this topic in the past. And essentially, what we're trying to do now in this sales conversation is inflate this issue so that it's big enough to want to address with a solution, which would naturally be ours, which we'll come to in a moment. However, if they haven't had any bad experiences themselves, the kind of second level of the second level, if you're, or phase two of this would be, if they don't have any direct experience themselves, then let's try and find experiences that they're aware of, perhaps through their industry counterparts or high-profile cases in news, for example, and use them. If there's none of those that are specifically available, then the third level would be for me or the salesperson to recite examples of their clients that have experienced issues that this prospect could potentially encounter. So you've got those kind of three levels. Number one would be personal experiences, which is more likely to get you the sale because it's more relevant for them. The second level is kind of industry or market issues, and then the third would be, okay, if there's nothing to relate, then it's experiences that I can relate to the client myself. So we're inflating the problem, and then ultimately what we're trying to do is understand, okay, once the problem is so big, essentially now it's time to ask the client or prospect rather, what is your vision of the solution? And if you've had a conversation, if the conversation is structured well enough, essentially the picture they now paint of the solution is essentially what you have in your toolkit. So it's a natural buying process, and it removes the stress of trying to close a deal because you essentially ask the client to tell them they want what you have. So I think sorry, it's a long-winded way of explaining it, but I think it's interesting. Do you know what I mean?
Well, maybe it could be surprising if you ask the client for their stories, you know, because people expect the salesperson to be the one doing the talking. So if you're actually really good at listening and you're asking for their stories, that could be surprising. Or if they don't have any, you can always make something up.
You know, when I was a stockbroker years ago, we had the saying when I was a stockbroker years ago was telling isn't selling.
Yeah.
So we've got, like I say, we've got to let these guys speak and relate their experiences 100%.
Oh,
okay, so just in the interest of time, let's move on. Let's jump into point number 5. Tell us about this.
Okay, number 5 is kill your jargon. Okay, this stuff because people in cybersecurity, just like people in technology, even though cybersecurity is technology, but anyway, they're all related. And then also, like even marketing people. Oh my gosh, I recently wrote a book on marketing technology, and I was shocked at the jargon, marketing jargon.
Yeah.
So, I want to tell you that, you know, for example, I've been to many a corporate campus, and hard as I try, I cannot find the elusive silo. I have never seen a silo on a corporate campus, but I keep reading about them everywhere. Like, where is it? I want to find the silo. Which was a request for me. Unless you're like, I don't know, Monsanto or something, they might have one.
Exactly. Yeah. That's ultimately where you got to go.
So, jargon is usually jargon words. They're shortcuts. They're shorthand for terms that people in your industry know, and they're often very vague. Sometimes they really have no real meaning that I can find. In all cases, jargon tends to be a language unto itself, and so people who aren't in your industry, non-cyber geeks, may not know what in the world you're talking about. And when they lose the meaning of your words, then it's going to be harder to engage with them. So it's better to just avoid it when you can. And also, I want to add that I think that when people are using terms like upskilling, even on-prem, pen testing, when you're using these terms all day long, I mean, actually, pen testing is not a good example. On-prem is kind of a good example. Upskilling is a great example. Upskilling, why not just say training?
Yeah.
Leverage, oh, I hate that word. Just say use. I mean, leverage
Yeah.
is a word. It means something different. It means like to actually use a lever. But anyway, or if you have leverage, it means you have something that you're going to use to get what you want. You have some leverage. But to leverage something is really, it's just drives me nuts. So I think that when people hear this all day and they talk this way at work and they hear it at work, that when they hear, then when they're engaging, when they hear it, the terminology or the concepts presented using plain everyday non-geek speak, it's just like fresh and new language, and it gets their mind to wake up. I know when people read it, it's much more engaging and easy to read.
Yeah, I think it's definitely impactful. Actually, definitely. I think you touched on a good point. You know, assuming that someone someone knows something is the easiest way to lose a sale, and I've seen this happen a number of times. Right, they can't quite understand why they weren't able to close the deal, and you kind of scrutinise the questioning that's gone on within the process, and yeah, there's just so much assumed knowledge there on the prospect side that's why they don't know what they're buying, or they don't know why it's even relevant for them. So these assumptions, and I say assumptions because the jargon is being used and it's just confused people. And I think that this is really an important point, because certainly in this part of the world, there's this mentality whereby people often say yes, they understand, to save face, rather than saying, no, I don't understand, or can you explain? So you leave that meeting thinking your prospect has understood everything you've said. In actual fact, you're never going to get this sale, because in actual fact, you don't know what you've said. So why risk putting yourself in that situation? Because this is a very hard situation to kind of unwind. Because if they're never going to admit that they don't understand, it's far better to go in with that mindset and use as, we're not talking about basic language that a 5-year-old would understand, but we're certainly talking in more kind of layman's terms. And I think that's really important, especially again in the part of the world where I work here in the UAE, where there's lots of different languages at play. English is the business language, let's say, but it's not necessarily everyone's mother tongue. So jargon is just another, is adding a level of complexity that's just not necessary.
Yeah, and then even just that are not necessarily jargon, but that are just cybersecurity terms that maybe people that not everyone understands. Like, I'm sure that right now with the Microsoft Exchange breach and that's happened, that everyone is using the term zero-day exploit, and I bet most people don't have any idea what it means. I have to look it up myself almost every time I use it, because zero-day exploit versus something else. It's like all these different types of cybersecurity breaches or malware, and I think it's confusing for people. So I think it's best to just try to use regular language. And when you're using a term like zero-day exploit, or say penetration testing, maybe even explain what that is if you think you need to. Or instead of saying on-prem, say on-premises, your on-premises data center. That's pretty easy to understand. So if you have to use a term like zero-day exploit, just explain what it is in a few words. So
yeah, exactly, and that's the skill, right? If you can't do that, then you need to learn a little bit more about the topic to enable you to do that, because that's going to be important when it comes to either explaining this in articles or actually having these sales conversations, right?
Yeah, there are lots of online resources that define cybersecurity terms. So okay.
No, I think the kind of extension to point 6. So point 6 was point 5 was kill your jargon. I think point 6 is almost an extension of that to some extent, which is avoid acronyms, right?
Avoid acronyms. That's right. Like, don't use acronyms. Don't say DDoS. Don't say GDPR. I mean, it's the federal government is a they love acronyms, and the U.S. federal government loves acronyms, and I'm guessing other governments are the same. If you can avoid using that, then please do. And I guess there are some, there's all those compliance frameworks, CCPA, GDPR, ISO, NIST, FedRAMP. But sometimes people are going to know what NIST is, and then they're going to know what FedRAMP is. You don't necessarily have to spell out the acronym, but you can maybe explain what it is, again, in a few words. And so, because it's just, when you hear when I hear those acronyms, I just feel like, I don't know, my eyes glaze over once again. My eyes, yeah. So, yeah, say Internet of Things, say IoT, say artificial intelligence, not AI, because people don't always understand what you're saying. So,
you know what, for me it's interesting because in my experience, what I've seen in my sales career, if you like, is quite often, again, acronyms can often be used to mask, if you like, knowledge gaps on the side of the seller. But then also, again, people nod in recognition, but in actual fact, they don't know what they're talking about. So again, you risk this misunderstanding or miscommunication, which you never want to happen in a sales conversation. But I'll give you an example. I actually received an email a few days ago from a well-known vendor here in the UAE, and the message reads this: as you may know, company ABC has been a pioneer when it comes to XDR technology. It doesn't explain what XDR technology is anywhere in the email. It actually makes a few other different references to different acronyms. But even if you knew XDR or had a basic understanding that XDR stood for Extended Detection and Response, again, what does that mean? Even, do you know what I mean? There's a you understand who these messages are being sent to, and we can't assume that everybody knows as much as we do. So we ought to keep it brief, but keeping it brief doesn't necessarily imply that we need to use acronyms, right? There's a fine balance here, isn't there?
I thought XDR stood for extra dumb rhetoric.
Well, you could use that as well. I think I'll have a chat to these guys and see if they ask if that's it.
So to keep you engaged, my humor.
Exactly.
7.
Yes. 7.
Number 7 is tell stories. And this goes back to the analogy you told at the beginning of our webinar. I love the story, and analogies are great. Great storytelling, techniques. Everybody loves a good story. Our brains are wired for story. The human brain is wired for story. And the story, the typical, the time-honored tradition of storytelling is, you build to a climax. You've got the narrative arc, you build to a climax, and then you have the rising action, the climax, to the falling action, the denouement at the end. And that is we love that. We love the rising tension. We love the anecdote about our own experiences. We love the anecdote about someone else's experiences. We love the analogy that grounds something technological in the real world. Like taking the leaves off as opposed and snapping off the stem in the garden, as opposed to rooting out the problem altogether. So. I think
so. I love the idea of storytelling. I think that obviously keeping it relevant to the topic of product or service you're selling is obviously key, and bringing the buyer into that story as well, especially if you can relate it to something that they've experienced themselves. The more they can feel attached to the situation, the more relevant it is to them, and more relevant therefore the solution becomes. But I mean, storytelling, look, you can bring that into conversation. It doesn't have to be necessarily relevant for the product. It might even just be relevant for you as an individual, just so that people remember you. I remember when I was I used to have a handful of different stories I would tell when I was a stockbroker to nothing to do with stocks, but it was just to make people remember me. And one story was pretty elaborate. It was about me chopping down a tree in my garden on the weekend, and the tree fell down and crashed into my neighbour's car. It was actually a completely fictitious story, but it was very well polished, and people remembered me for it.
Salespeople did that, made up your own stories. Yeah.
Anyway, that's another lifetime. So yeah, definitely storytelling is super important, right?
And talking about cybersecurity, I think getting people to tell their own stories is really a good idea. I'm thinking about like, I met this filmmaker and I wanted to impress him, so I told him I'm a novelist, which I am. And he was pretty impressed by that. But then when he found out that I was a cybersecurity writer, oh, his ears just perked up. He like leaned close. He's like talking to me. He's like really engaging. And what he wants to know is my phone spying on me? Is my, you're right? He's like, is social media safe to use? Like he had all these burning questions about cybersecurity and privacy. And the same happens when I meet someone new and I tell them I'm a cybersecurity writer, often they'll start asking me those kinds of questions.
Really?
Yeah, people, they care about cybersecurity on a personal level. I think a lot of people really do. They think about it, they think about their privacy, the world is changing, and they want to know that they're secure and safe in the digital world. And so I think that maybe, I was selling cybersecurity products, I might try to engage with my prospects and my customers on that level, even further, sort of as to work my way into the bigger picture.
I think it's an important point you mentioned. I know yesterday you said that you were talking to someone who's trying to raise awareness of cybersecurity as well. And I think it's really important because cybersecurity, I think, can often be perceived at an employee level as someone else's responsibility, right? There's a tech team that deal with defending our infrastructure, let's say. They need to make sure the defenses are there so that whatever I do, I don't expose any vulnerability. But the reality is cybersecurity is everybody's responsibility. And I think that's part of the communication as well. Whatever product and service you're selling, it's making sure, obviously at a decision maker level, they're clearly aware of this. But then how do we, irrespective of the solutions you're now purchasing for your organization, how can you roll out, as part of this purchase, how can you roll out awareness that accompanies this throughout your organization? Because like you said, I think people are generally fascinated by cybersecurity, and if you're able to accompany any kind of product or service sale with a drive for awareness, that will surely improve the impact of that sale, and certainly that relationship, right, as you move forward.
Well, and also, the cybersecurity industry, just like technology, they have their roots in military. In the Department of Defense. The internet began with the Department of Defense. I believe the first computers were also Department of Defense project. Wrong, but about that. But cybersecurity has its roots in the Department of Defense, and so I think that's one reason why we use so much military terminology when we talk about cybersecurity. Attack vectors, attack surface. They used to talk about demilitarized zones, and and I think that in a way that's maybe exciting, but it also can be somewhat alienating. Just so cold and apart from our non-military world. So storytelling can bring a human touch and help to establish a human connection.
Definitely. Excellent. Look, we've got 2 more points to. We're not going to rush through them, obviously, but let's move on to number 8 in the interest of time.
Okay, that's pretty short. Keep it simple.
Yeah, that's exactly what it says on the tin, right?
So use as few words as possible. Don't say a majority of when you can say most. Just that's one example. I'm going to give a short example. A client who hopefully isn't watching right now, He wrote a something for a white paper that I was working on. This is what he wrote. I'm just going to give you the first paragraph. CSPs across the world are embarking on a 5G journey. 5G requires massive investment in terms of spectrum price, along with the OSS/BSS and the infrastructure cost. One of the many ways to realize revenue is to monetize the network by working with enterprise customers to bring their applications to the edge via MEC. And I'm like, oh my God, I had to go like, drink a cup of coffee.
I wouldn't read any more. I'm genuinely interested in the topic of 5G, but that wouldn't have been an article I would have continued reading.
Well, he's not a writer. He doesn't pretend to be a writer. He's just giving me the information, right? But he wasn't, I couldn't really use this information. I had to, it took me a long time to really unpack what he was saying because there's just too many words. One of the main ways to realize revenue is to monetize the network. I mean, one way to make more money is to, X. That's such an easier way to say it and so much more engaging. So simple. And
I think again, it's just going to roll into from one of the examples I was earlier on. Again, keeping it simple is something we need to adopt. Certainly, again, when we're talking in a country where there's multiple languages at play, right? Because I'll give you an example. In English, we typically use far more words than are necessary, right? Especially being British as well. We're almost over polite sometimes. I'll give you an example, right? So I was this was actually quite a few years ago when we first moved to Dubai. I was in a restaurant and I wanted to order a can of Coke, right? And I said to I asked for the waiter to come over and I said, "Excuse me, my friend, please can I have a glass of Coke?" And obviously he went and got me what I wanted. Then I noticed at the table next to me, this gentleman put his hand up, ushered the waiter over, and he just said Coke, and he got the same. Now, obviously, being British, I would certainly argue that one was more polite than the other. But the question is, forget the politeness. We achieved the same result. The message was the same. The person who received the message was in no way offended. So, I think there is an art to keeping it simple, and I think it's a key message for us to take on board here, definitely.
And as I said before, I think sometimes people use a lot of words and they use a lot of big words because they think they sound better. I used to write for a university, and I wrote about agriculture. And I was talking about how when you tell people, like, you write cybersecurity, their eyes glaze over. When I tell people I wrote agriculture, I could see their attention wandering right away. But I wrote about cultural research from Montana State University, and I would interview, professors, science researchers at the university about some fascinating new research they were doing. And, I'd write these press releases that had their quotes, the things they said to me. I'd take notes and I'd choose the very best sentences they said and I'd use them in the press release. And then I'd send them to the professor to approve. And often they would take this wonderful quote and they would change it. And they'd add in all these words and these big words because they were so worried about how they sounded. It's the same.
We wanted to sound smart and educated and polished. But this is so it leads into actually the last point, number 9. So number 9 is polish your prose. So how does that fit with keeping
to writing? But if you're giving a presentation or a pitch, it's the same. Hemingway said, I don't know if I'm allowed to use profanity. Hemingway said, the first draft is always bleep. It's like almost a cliche in the writing world, but it's true. Like the first thing you write is not going to be very good. Just get it down. That's what I always do. I use the agile method of writing. I just get it down, whatever, and then I go back and I refine and I improve and I update and I patch. So then because the art of writing happens in revision, the art of that speech writing or that pitch. So when you're finished writing, no matter how stellar you think it is, take a step away, give it overnight or longer if you can, so it can cook. That's writer jargon. Let your prose cook. And so you can approach it with fresh eyes. And when you do that, you freshen your lead. Make sure that your lead is the first. We're going to go over these 9 points, right? Make sure your lead is, you haven't buried your lead, that you're saying the most important thing first. Translate your jargon if you have jargon. Cut out your extraneous words, any words you don't need, and any words that are big, you can make into small, plain words. Change it then. Weave in an anecdote or two. You get some storytelling in there, throw in a few surprises if you can, maybe a little joke or some new information that you think people will find surprising. And do that all before you submit or before you use, before you give your pitch or before you.
I think this is it. The point here, right, is just practice, 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 practice. Like I say, your revision when it comes to writing, practice when you come to sales. And I think the key thing is there also is when you measure the success of either that the content that you put out or the sales conversation that you've embarked upon. Once you find something that actually works, that delivers the results that you want, whether that be a sale or hits on a website or new subscribers or whatever it is, use the same thing again, right? Or use the same process at least. And that will enable you to continue being successfsul. Listen, we're going to have to leave it there, Sherry, because we're pretty much out of time. Thoroughly enjoyed that session. Just to kind of quickly summarize, although you partly did it in the last one anyway. So the 9 points, just in summary, guys. Dare to be different. Get to the point. Stay focused. Surprise your audience. Kill your jargon. Avoid acronyms, tell stories, keep it simple, and polish your prose. Thank you so much, Sherry, for joining us. Thoroughly enjoyed today's session. Guys, I hope you've enjoyed the session also. They will be posted live in the next couple of days, and we'll see you again next month. Sorry, Sherry, I was talking over you then. You want to say goodbye?
Bye, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Bye, guys. Take care. Bye.
If you have any questions, contact me on LinkedIn. I'm always there.
Excellent. Thank you, Sherry.